it didn't work out too well for these government sort of nudge brigades, because what they wanted to do was to try and get people to drink less alcohol during lockdown, and it turned out they all started drinking more. Who can blame them? Some of them are still doing it. Jamie, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike. I think you can probably add me onto the list of people who drank more alcohol during lockdown. It was a pretty boring time for most.
Well, it really was. I mean, there's only so many things you can watch on Netflix, and once you've sort of finished the catalogue, and of course now that people are working from home this week because of the train strike, the weather's at least nice. I mean, that was the good thing about the first lockdown, was that it was in quite decent weather. But in the winter, when lockdown came along, I think for a lot of people there was literally nothing else to do but drink.
No, nothing to do but drink, Mike. I think listening to you for the last 2 or 3 years has kind of kept a lot of people sane.
I think it has, actually. I mean, people do say that, so I'm grateful for when they do say that. Let's talk a bit about inflation first of all, though, because obviously there's so much going on now. We've got the rail strike, we've got pressure on wages from places like the RMT and others. Barristers are going on strike as well. Everybody's moaning they can't afford to buy things that they used to be able to afford to buy. I think today we're officially at 9.5%, up from 9, possibly heading for 11. You've put some numbers together, though, so tell us about it.
Yeah, so what you can do, Mike, is obviously we've got the way the ONS does the inflation figures, they kind of have a basket of goods, so they don't literally go around the shops with a basket and count the cost of them. They put a load of kind of products that you would generally buy in the economy, and then they track the prices of those kind of commodities, and then you can look at the change month on month, year on year. And the current inflation rate that's been published this morning is 9.1%. So that means basically that compared to the same basket of goods a year earlier, it's 9.1%. Some things have gone up more than other things. And then what you can do is look across the whole economy, Mike, and work out, OK, so what's contributing to that 9.1%? Because if the government wants to try and control inflation, you need to know what's driving the 9.1%. So I crunched some of the numbers that they published this morning. And around approaching like 2/3 of the increase is driven basically by things that the viewer and the listener won't be surprised by, is the housing costs, water, gas, electric, transport costs, and then food costs are going up as well, because remember, people deliver the food using fuel in the lorries and things, and food commodities are going up across the world. So those are what's driving the kind of the inflation at the moment, Mike. And it's not demand-led inflation. So what demand-led inflation is, say, for example, me and you had loads more money and there's only a finite amount of goods in the economy. You might try and spend a little bit more than me, so the price would go up. That's not what's driving the inflation at the moment. So the Bank of England, who are trying to control inflation by giving us less money, by encouraging us to save, or increasing mortgage rates through interest rates, it's a bit kind of bonkers in terms of doing that, Mike, because what the government could do, if the things that are driving the inflation the most, they could cut the green levies, they could cut VAT on domestic fuel. That's one of the things Boris Johnson and Michael Gove were saying one of the benefits of Brexit were to actually reduce the VAT or scrap it completely. So, if you're talking about planks of the week, Mike, I think Boris and Michael Gove could be thrown in there. And I also looked yesterday, Mike, at the fuel prices. So you've been tracking these for the last couple of weeks.
Right.
Now, they cut the fuel duty back in March by 5 pence, but petrol prices have gone up now on average. I know they do vary, and you've seen some really bonkers prices, I think, from the viewers and listeners sending them in to you. But the unleaded petrol is about 1.87 per litre. Now, that's up 57 pence on this time last year, about 530 quid for the average driver that's going to cost. But more importantly, Mike, the tax take that the Chancellor's taking now on a litre of fuel is more now than this time last year. So he cut fuel duty by 5 pence, but because of the VAT on the fuel, he's actually taking 4.5 pence per litre more. So if the Chancellor announced, or if Boris Johnson did, said at Prime Minister's questions, from 6 p.m. tonight we're going to cut 4.5 pence per litre off fuel, that would be no different to what they were probably planning on having last year. So there's no reason for no inaction, Mike.
No, of course. And it goes to show as well that the people who are buying the fuel are not buying it because they fancy driving around in a nice car and sort of looking out the window. They're buying it because they have to buy it, because they have to use a car, because it's the only means of transport in most parts of the country for most people. That's why the train strike for me is not going to be as effective as the RMT think it will be, because an awful lot of people now have given up on the trains because they're so unreliable.
No, and trains, I was looking at the numbers online yesterday, Mike. So train passenger journeys obviously fell off a cliff during COVID because the government told us all to stay at home. We can't really blame the train companies for that. But the consequence of all of that, Mike, and with civil servants obviously working from home still, a lot of them, is that demand for passenger journeys has gone down, and the current new normal is about 1/3 lower, Mike. So you need to reform. The French government who run the kind of the nationalised rail services, issued a paper recently looking at driverless trains, and the unions are obviously trying to stop reforms of the rail service. But if we want a fit for 21st century rail service, you're going to need these reforms, Mike. And you're right in terms of fuel and price, because the way things normally work is if the price goes up, we buy less of it. And if the price goes down, we might buy more of it. But when it comes to things like petrol or gas and electric, well, the relationship between prices and demand isn't the kind of the same as what it would be for other goods. Because what you see, Mike, is that if the price goes up, you can't, you don't turn down the heating, or you don't say, I can't drive to work. You have to do these things. And I think the charts that you've got up on the screen now, what that's showing is that, the big driver of fuel at the moment, and in terms of the inflation, is the domestic fuel and the utility cost. And petrol, every week I put a tweet out saying, another week record fuel prices, and the way things are going, next week I'll be putting another tweet out, Mike, with another week record fuel prices.
Yeah, and you say people aren't actually not putting the heating on, but I think that will happen come the autumn, once it starts to get properly colder. And I know there are parts of the country that are colder than the southeast. It's pretty warm here at the moment. But there will be people in October and November, if prices don't come down, who will have to make that decision and say, look, we can't put the heating on. Or at least, if we are going to put it on, we're only going to put it on like for a couple of hours, and then we're going to put it off again.
And Mike, one of the things that the Office for National Statistics do is they look at excess winter mortality. And when you get cold winters, it tends to affect kind of elderly people, because they do worry about these things, which is why you've got the winter fuel allowance to try and combat that. So this cost of living crisis and fuel price rises, which again, remember, Mike, we had that big rise in April. We're going to get another massive rise in October. The Chancellor's putting some money back into the into pockets to try and alleviate all of that, but it probably won't be enough, Mike. And this is likely to cause more deaths if we don't really act. And part of the problem, Mike, is inaction by government over the last 10 or 15 years. I looked at a strategy that they did under the coalition government. Ed Davey was from the Lib Dems, was in the coalition government in the Department for Business and Energy at the time. And there was an energy security strategy with very little in there about how we secure the energy when you think about the wars in Ukraine.
Nobody ever talks about it. I mean, we knew that there was a rising price problem happening, last year. But even before that, people knew that the prices had been going up, and the renewables were the thing that people talked about as being the future. But we all knew that that was all going to come to a crashing end at some point, apart from apparently everybody in the government.
No, and France has been a little insulated a little bit more from the fuel increases, because they've got a lot more nuclear, Mike, so they've got a bit more energy security over there in France than what we've got. And Boris keeps saying, oh, well, under Labour we didn't do much with nuclear power. This is the government are going to be driving more on nuclear. Well, hang on, Boris. The government or the Tory party have been in charge since 2010. So, 2022 coming up with a new strategy. Do you have to wait 12 years for them to come up with an idea on these things, Mike?
Unbelievable. And interestingly enough, just on the health front, because I know you used to do an awful lot of health statistics for us, Dr. Charles Levinson tweeted out this morning. He says, I don't believe I've heard a single question put to a senior politician in government about the sustained level of non-COVID excess deaths in the home since March 2020. It continues even now, hundreds and hundreds every week. Yet it goes by almost completely ignored. It's wrong. I think he's right about that, isn't he?
No, he is right, Mike. I've been tweeting a little bit about that over the last kind of 2 years or so. What we then saw then, Mike, is that people were told to stay home, protect the NHS, because you can't see loved ones in hospital. We might have seen a little bit of a shift in terms of some people who in the past may have gone into hospital towards the end of life and then sadly died in hospital. What we might be seeing is people are staying at home now because they can't get their relatives to come and see them. But that's not going to make up for the complete numbers that we're seeing, Mike, in terms of the excess deaths at home. And, the consequences, I think one of the stories that's been branded about today is GPs looking to retire over the next few years.
Yes.
And Jeremy Hunt a few months back, Mike, he was saying that he failed to recruit enough GPs, because we have seen a rise in the number of GPs over the last 5 or 6 years. But that's only small in comparison to the rise in the population. We've got about overall about 36,000 GPs when you look at the full-time hours that they're doing, up from about 34,000 in 2015. But what Jeremy Hunt wanted to do was get at least 5,000, and he admitted that people are leaving kind of general practice faster than they can get people in overall.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons. And part of the reason, it could be that, it's much easier for them to go private So if GPs go private, what do you end up doing? You can't get a GP appointment, which you've been talking about now for, not just the last year, at least the last 2 years.
At least the last 2
They
years.
end up having to get one private.
Yeah, it is extraordinary what's going on inside the NHS. Not one bit of it, as I've often said, seems to be working at the moment. Jamie, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Catching up there with Jamie Jenkins and some independent statistics. Basically, another record fuel price at the pump week. This week, unleaded, an average is now up to 1.87 per litre. I'm sure many of you are paying more than that. That's 57 pence higher than it was a year ago. Extraordinary figures. Absolutely amazing.